Hello and welcome into another episode of Lockdown Wolves. Today on the show, we're digging into the lineup question. Chris Finch is back to using the opening day lineup with Mike Conley and Rudy Gobert back in the starting lineup. Is that the right pairing to run with the rest of the starters? Or what about the Donte DiVincenzo Naz Reid pairing? We'll compare those lineups to each other. We'll also talk about the most advantageous Julius Randle lineups, and we'll look at the crucial Western Conference tiebreakers. It's all upcoming. Welcome in. You are Lockdown Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I am the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Tuesday, everybody. The Timberwolves are not in action until tomorrow night, so we are taking a half step back here, looking at Wolves lineups now with the return of the now healthy Rudy Gobert, the now healthy Julius Randle, the now healthy Donte DiVincenzo. We're back to basically what this roster looked like on opening night. So what's that going to do to Chris Finch's rotations? We saw a hint of it on Sunday in Gobert's first game back, but I want to dig in a bit on what this thing could look like moving forward, the pros and cons to starting the veterans, as in Conley, Gobert, and not that Naz and Donte DiVincenzo aren't veterans, but the older, the former Jazz pairing, the former Jazz pick and roll pairing in the starting lineup versus the Naz Reid Donte DiVincenzo pairing, along with Nickeil Alexander-Walker, et cetera, off the bench. So I want to look at kind of the differences there. And then I want to dig into the all-important Western Conference tiebreakers, because the West is obviously a rough and tumble race. It's going to come down to the wire for seeding. And the Wolves have some key tiebreakers at their disposal, or I should say, I guess, in their back pockets, a better way to say that, in the West. So I want to talk about all that on the show today. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And a reminder, you can also subscribe to the Locked On Wolves daily newsletter at LockedOnDaily.com. It's one stop for Ultimate Wolves and NBA coverage delivered right to your email inbox. Sign up for free at LockedOnDaily.com. All right. So Timberwolves had obviously a bunch of injuries over the last couple of months after having a really healthy first 3 months of the season, by and large. The Julius Randle injury, and then the DiVincenzo came first, then Randle, and then the Rudy Gobert injury. And for a while, they didn't have any of those guys. Mike Conley was banged up toward the beginning of the season. Now the roster's back to where it was on opening night. And of course, Chris Finch's preferred starting lineup is Mike Conley, Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Julius Randle, and Rudy Gobert. And then, going back to that bench unit, the bench mob unit from the beginning of the season, Donte DiVincenzo, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Naz Reid, being essentially the Wolves' three best plus-minus players, three best net rating guys early in the season. And then at various points, they've all had to start games for this team due to injury, briefly before all the injuries, due to ineffectiveness. Remember, DiVincenzo found his way in the starting lineup. Mike Conley was coming off the bench because the starting lineup was ineffective. And finally, Chris Finch pulled that switch in January, just a few days before DiVincenzo hurt his toe against the Warriors. So now overall this season, DiVincenzo's only started 9 games. Nickeil Alexander-Walker has started 10. Naz has started 17 because of the combination of injuries between Julius Randle and Julius Randle and Rudy Gobert. So now, with everybody fully healthy on Sunday against the San Antonio Spurs, Chris Finch went back to that opening night starting lineup with Rudy Gobert at the 5, Conley at the 1, and in between the starters you'd expect to see, Ant, Jaden, and Julius Randle. A lot of Timberwolves fans, I think, were maybe not caught off guard because Chris Finch was very loyal to this particular lineup at the start of the season, and I understand why, and I guess we'll get into that a bit. But I said this at the time. I was defensive of Chris Finch sticking with this group. The reason is because, while the early returns weren't positive, there was no reason to think it wouldn't continue to improve. and it did marginally so. But the other thing is, like, the staggering of the lineups is more important. And also, Mike Conley functions better with Rudy Gobert on the floor. Rudy Gobert functions better with Mike Conley on the floor than the alternatives. And so it makes sense to sync those groups up. And knowing that Anthony Edwards is going to play with every possible combination, it didn't matter as much who started. And so does it make more sense to start the guys who have made all-star teams in the case of Gobert, all NBA teams and in Defensive Player of the Year awards as recently as last year, to perhaps not, and I don't think anyone's suggesting Rudy doesn't start, but of course the question was, does Conley start, or is it DiVincenzo, or is there a world in which Randle doesn't start and it's Gobert and Naz in the starting lineup? So it's not like, I understand this isn't, I'm creating a little bit of a false choice, and I want to admit that I understand that. The question isn't simply, as it says in the graphic on YouTube, Conley and Gobert versus DiVincenzo and Naz. It's not. That's, again, a bit of a false choice. That's not the only options here, because you can start Naz and Gobert together. You could even start Conley and DiVincenzo together if you wanted to play smaller. Like, that's possible. I don't think the Wolves would ever do that, because then Ant's at the 3 and the whole thing's weird. But for the sake of argument, those are basically the positions we're talking about. Like, realistically, Julius Randle's probably not coming off the bench here. But if he was, you would start Naz with Gobert. So that's why I'm kind of boiling it down to these two pairings. I think that's probably the best way to look at it. So first, let's look at the starters, or let's look at the DiVincenzo, McDaniels, Randle, Edwards 4-man group. Okay. And here's why. Conley is the one in this conversation of these 8 guys who's played the worst if you take the body of work. To be clear, he's played a lot better of late. He shot the 3 great since mid-January. But he's obviously had more peaks and valleys. There's less to rely upon when it comes to 37-year-old Mike Conley than anybody else in the top 8. Right? The starting 5 from opening night, plus DiVincenzo, Alexander Walker, and Naz Reid. So taking him out of the equation, and then Gobert, because he missed the last month, look at the 4-man pairing of DiVincenzo and Ant in the backcourt with McDaniels and Randle. Overall this year, they're a minus 2.8. Their most successful group was with Naz Reid at the 5, not with Rudy Gobert at the 5. They played more possessions with Rudy than with Naz, but with Rudy, they're a minus 6.1. That 4-man pairing is. With Naz Reid, they're a plus 2.3. Okay, so I want to acknowledge that. Now, it's still kind of a middle-of-the-pack unit, and they're good offensively. They're not as good defensively. Naz is a solid defensive 4 and has been for most of the year. Depending on the opponent, he struggles at the 5. He's not a traditional rim protector. He's undersized. He's not a great defensive rebounder, although he's shown flashes the last couple of years of real improvement there. But he is a solid weak side shot blocker as a 4. He's switchable. He's athletic. He's much better at understanding the team concept now than he was in his first 2+ years in the league. But those units are better offensively, and overall a plus 2.3. With Rudy instead of Naz, they're bad on both ends of the floor, weirdly enough, and a minus 6.1 overall. Digging into the 2-man pairings, and we can start with the Naz Donte one, because that's the one that's part of that 5-man group I just mentioned. Naz and Donte DiVincenzo together as a 2-man group, according to Cleaning the Glass, all these numbers are Cleaning the Glass numbers, are a plus 8.3. They're an 86th percentile league-wide unit, 68th percentile on offense, and a 91st percentile on defense. Now, to be clear, the best defensive lineups still include Rudy Gobert with that pairing. For instance, the most used and best defensive and overall lineup for the Naz Donte 2-man is also with Rudy and Mike Conley. It's, weirdly enough, does not include Anthony Edwards. It's Mike Conley, Donte DiVincenzo, Alexander Walker at the 3, Naz Reid at the 4, and Rudy Gobert at the 5. So there's your argument to start Naz Reid instead of Julius Randle, because it's a 98th percentile defensive unit in just under 198 possessions, and still a 63rd percentile offensive unit. They're a plus 29.2. Again, Conley and Gobert with the bench mob. Remember this from the beginning of the year. We talked about this quite a bit way back, like probably around Christmas was the last time we really dug in on this. but the bench mob plus the veterans. So completely invert this conversation. Take Conley and Gobert, plop them on the bench, include them with the bench unit. Not that. And here's the funny thing is, like, we treat this like teams do hockey line changes, or like it's like fifth grade basketball. It's like 5 in, 5 out. That's not typically what happens. Hardly ever happens, right? And sometimes you get there through various combinations of guys going in and out. But rarely does Chris Finch actually play a 10-man rotation, and rarely is, one of Ant or Randle not on the floor, for instance, or one of Ant, Randle, Gobert not on the floor. But if you did, and you flipped it, and Conley and Gobert came off the bench, and you started, I don't know, in this case, I guess you wouldn't not start either Nas or Gobert, because you're not going to start Randle at the 5. It's just funny that this is how it turns out, because it's like Conley and Gobert are the guys who were out or who were injured in some capacity, or Conley was, barely contributing to the rotation, and Gobert was out. And you take the 3 bench mob guys and Donte, Nas, and Nikhil, you play them with Conley and Gobert, and it's a plus 29.2 unit in basically 200 possessions, 98th percentile defensively. The other one with Gobert that also includes Nas and Donte has Alexander Walker and Ant instead of Conley, and only 11 less possessions. That is a 97th percentile defensive unit. Weirdly, subbing Ant for Conley makes the offense go from 63rd percentile to 17th percentile. Is some of that small sample size noise? Yeah, probably, but it's also basically 200 possessions. It's not a minuscule sample size. And the offense gets 12 plus points worse per 100 possessions if you put Ant on the floor instead of Conley. Now, overall, it's a 75th percentile overall unit, because it's still a great unit and the defense is still so dominant. So the takeaway here is Nas and Donte are really, really good together, but they're good together with a real point guard and a real center, like Mike Conley and Rudy Gobert, or Donte along with another creator and Ant and Rudy Gobert. It's not necessarily the Nas at the 5 units, which those are good too. Like one of them doesn't have Gobert, but it's not nearly as good defensively, and it's not as good overall as that best 94th percentile unit. So I want to put a bow on the Donte Nas thing, and then I want to move on to talk about Julius Randle. We'll also talk about Conley and Gobert together. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Skims. When I found out Skims was making underwear for men, I was intrigued. I've heard a ton about their quality from friends and family, so I had to give it a try. Let me tell you, Skims lives up to the hype. I've always had issues with underwear. I'm sure I'm not alone, because there's a lot of things that have to go right when it comes to underwear, right? They have to fit right. They have to actually be comfortable. You have to also find the right style for you, and Skims changes all that. Their men's line delivers something for everyone, from boxer briefs to classic briefs, all designed with the perfect balance of comfort and style. I tried the Skims Stretch 5-inch boxer briefs, and I'm hooked. They're super comfortable. They're perfect for my lifestyle. Some days more active than others, but if I'm walking a lot, which I do sometimes for my day job, running around, chasing kids outside, coaching sports teams, they're comfortable. They never lose their shape, and they stay in place all day. If you're just running errands or whatever around the house on the weekend, they're definitely the most comfortable and reliable underwear that you'll ever own. Plus, the lightweight material feels amazing, almost like you're wearing nothing at all. Shop Skims Men's at skims.com/LockedOnNBA and Skims stores. Let them know that we sent you. After you place your order, select podcast in the survey and select this show in the drop-down menu that follows. Again, select podcast in the survey. After you place your order, select our show in the drop-down menu that follows. All right, so getting back to lineup stuff, moral of the story is Nas and Donte together are great. 86th percentile unit, a plus 8.3, no matter how you slice it and dice it. But the very best lineups are generally with Gobert and either Conley or Ant. Okay? Now, moving on to Conley and Gobert together. Remember, Nas and Donte together are in 1,754 possessions. So over 1,700 possessions. They're an 86th percentile unit. Over 2,000 possessions of Conley and Gobert together this year. And for all the hand-wringing over the starting lineup, they are an 83rd percentile unit, a plus 7.3. in over 2,000 possessions, only 1 point behind the plus 8.3 that the Nas and Donte lineups have put up. Now, to be clear, half of those possessions are with the, quote, preferred starting lineup that Chris Finch went back to on Sunday with the team fully healthy of Conley, Edwards, McDaniels, Randle, and Gobert. That unit is still just a 50th percentile unit. It is up to a plus 3.1, but it's not been good offensively, and it's only been a little above really average on the defensive end. So it nets out to roughly an average offense, okay? Which for a team that has designs on, at the start of the year, the finals, and was a conference finals team last year, it's not ideal. But what buoys this number is like every other Gobert and Conley pairing is dynamic, basically. The next most used one is only 200 possessions. So, 20% of, a fifth of that regular starting lineup. And what is it? It's the same thing, but it's with Nas instead of Randle. And it goes from a plus 3.1 to a plus 26.3, from a 50th percentile unit to a 92nd percentile unit by putting Nas on the floor instead of Julius Randle with Rudy Gobert and Mike Conley. The next most used one, only 11 possessions behind the prior one, you take off Edwards and McDaniels and replace them with DiVincenzo and Alexander Walker. So this is a DiVincenzo Nas lineup, one of the ones we just talked about, with Conley, Alexander Walker, Gobert, no Ant. That's a 94th percentile unit, a plus 29.2. And you go on down the line, and in the top, top 7 most used lineups with Conley and Gobert, 5 of them are positive. 4 of them are at least double-digit positive, plus 10 or greater. There's only 2 that are negative in that. Actually, no, I'm sorry. Only 1. I misread that. Only 1 in the top 6 is a negative. And that is a weird lineup that doesn't have a whole lot of offense, and I'm not sure why the Wolves, well, I should say it that way. It's a lineup that I don't like. They're not going to use all that often. Conley, DiVincenzo, McDaniels, Nas, and Rudy. Weird to not have Ant on the floor with that group. And I'm trying to think of, like, I don't know, Conley and DiVincenzo in the backcourt. Like, I know I just mentioned the one with Gobert and Nas, and that one with Alexander Walker on the floor was good. I don't know. It's just a weird, like, having McDaniels on the floor with DiVincenzo and Conley and no Ant, and no Alexander Walker. Just like it's missing something there. And that lineup's not very good. The rest of those are all really good, though. So, rewinding a little, what does this tell us about what Chris Finch wants to do? Well, I think we can, we have to take Sunday as a little bit of a standalone because we had not seen this group together, and it was not good defensively. But offensively, things hummed along very well. Part of that is the new approach to offensive rebounding, which we haven't seen a whole lot of since all the injuries cropped up 7 weeks ago or so, mid-January. And Gobert also only played 20 minutes due to foul trouble. And then the fourth quarter, there was no Ant because the game was out of reach. So the jury is absolutely still out. But I'm very curious to see, with the increase in usage for Jaden McDaniels with guys out, and with Conley playing better of late, Gobert missing time of late, what that looks like for Chris Finch. Like, who's closing these games? He's been going away from Mike Conley at the end of games more than he did early in the season. I think that's a real possibility that we see DiVincenzo in crunch time instead of Mike Conley. I think it's also a real possibility that we see Nas Reid in crunch time instead of either Randle or Gobert. We saw a little bit of that. Remember that win over the Rockets in January when they closed with Nas at the 5 with Randle instead of Gobert? I think I care less about what the starting lineup looks like because Chris Finch has shown early in the season he was rigid with this. In October, November, even into December, he was closing with his starters. He was sticking with his guys, with his veterans. Was it cliche? Yeah. Was it overdone? Maybe a little bit. But he's building a cachet with this team, with the guys that maybe he's new to coaching. I know he coached on the staff with Randle in New Orleans, but as a head coach, this was a calculated decision early in the season, partly to see what you have, partly because you trust the veterans to an extent, and partly to build that cachet. And I think he's done that now a little bit. And you could argue you shouldn't have to do it if you're the head coach, but you still got to get buy-in, right? And so now Chris Finch has pushed the right buttons and pulled the right levers at the right moments. And I know they haven't won very many close games, but also they haven't been healthy in 7 weeks. And now you have the ability to say, hey, look, We close games with Nikhil. We close games with DiVincenzo. We close games with Naz Reid. We close games with TJ Shannon. We won that game in OKC with TJ Shannon, Rob Dillingham, and Jalen Clark playing minutes down the stretch. We could put, Joe Ingles in the middle of a zone or to throw inbounds passes at the end of the game. I've used my whole roster at this point if I'm Chris Finch. And I can say, look, this matchup and the way Naz is playing, he's going to play the 5 and Rudy's going to sit. Or this matchup, Rudy's going to play the 5, Naz is going to play with him, and Randle, you're going to take a seat because you didn't play, you're not making the right decisions in this game, right? Like, obviously, the last 3 games, Randle's been great. But whatever the case might be, the starting lineup matters less to me because Chris Finch has shown the willingness, the ability to tweak rotations and lineups down the stretch based on the situation, based on the hot hand, if you want to call it that, or who's playing well and who's not, based on the matchup. And we're also seeing, I think, a little bit more in terms of offensive and defensive subs down the stretch of games. Chris Finch has been more willing to do that of late. So that's encouraging to me. The last point I want to make here is Julius Randle. The most used lineup, of course, with Randle is that preferred starting lineup we talked about. The second most used is not a good one. It's with Gobert still and McDaniels and Ant, but it's with DiVincenzo instead of Conley. So this is weird because you think of the old, Knicks pairing of Randle and DiVincenzo and that working well, and you think of Conley is not playing well, right? And that's default starting lineup that Chris Finch rolls out, not playing well. Well, guess what? Take Conley off the floor, put DiVincenzo on, and that same lineup in a third as many possessions is a 27th percentile lineup. You go from a plus 3.1 to a minus 6.1 by taking Conley off and putting DiVincenzo on. That's not to say Conley's played better than DiVincenzo this year. The point is, when you take Conley off the floor, suddenly it's Ant and DiVincenzo that are splitting these possessions. And again, I do think the data trends more positively for that group recently, which is another example of Chris Finch having the ability to push certain buttons and pull certain levers based on the place that we are in the season. The best Randle lineup with any sort of like regular usage is with Naz Reid at the 5, with Ant, DiVincenzo, and Alexander Walker. And that lineup is 97th percentile offensively. It can do everything. It's a small ball lineup. Well, I say that. It's small ball with essentially Ant playing point guard with DiVincenzo and Alexander Walker, but no McDaniels on the floor. And yes, McDaniels has been much better offensively lately, but that is a potent offensive unit with Ant, DiVincenzo, and Alexander Walker, Randle, and Reid in the front court. They could do everything. It's a 97th percentile offensive unit, 137 points per 100 possessions, a plus 22.1, 87th percentile overall unit. So keep an eye on how Julius Randle is deployed moving forward. Keep an eye on more the crunch time, late game, clutch situational substitutions by Chris Finch, more so than the starting lineup. Now, of course, Chris Finch could come out on Wednesday against Denver and completely blow, do something different with the starters, and then this whole conversation is kind of moot. But I'm much more interested in how Finch closes games, who he trusts down the stretch, and how he handles his personnel there than with the starting lineup. It's not quite, I've talked about this comparison in the past. It's not Irvin Johnson, not Magic, not Timberwolves and Bucks Irvin Johnson, the center, starting in the 2003-2004 season and only playing the first 6 minutes of the first and third quarters. It's not quite to that level, kind of an honorary start, and then you don't go back to him. But there could be some of that with Conley down the stretch this season, where it's very situational when he plays, and he plays to get the team in a certain flow. And then, hey, if the shot's not falling, which it has been for the last 6 weeks or whatever, you don't need to play him as much. That's okay. I don't have a problem with that. Conley's still one of your best 8 or 9 players overall, and he's important to the flow of this team. So I'm not going to be wringing my hands over going back to this regular standard opening night starting lineup, whatever you want to call it. All right, I want to close by talking about the Western Conference landscape, current tiebreakers, where they're at, because that's important to understand here as we head down the home stretch of the regular season. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our sponsors at Wayfair. Your home should reflect your style, and with Wayfair, it's easier than ever to make that happen. Whether you're looking for a simple refresh or tackling a big home project, Wayfair has everything you need in one place. Wayfair's huge selection makes it easy to find the perfect piece, no matter your space or budget. From cozy furniture and stylish decor to kitchen essentials and outdoor must-haves, Wayfair has it all, and at prices that fit your budget. You can find the perfect piece. We actually just recently bought a rug. Wayfair was the best place to look for options for rugs. Lamps. We're actually still looking for a coffee table for our living room to tie everything together. Wayfair has a ton of stylish options. We have tons of tabs open all the time. My wife and I kind of emailing back and forth options to debate what the next best great piece is to add to our living room. Head over to wayfair.com and find something that's just your style today. That's wayfair.com, WAYFAIR.com. Wayfair, every style, every home. All right, Western Conference tiebreakers. Sitting here right now, as I record this, late Monday, action is mostly final. The only ongoing game is Sacramento. They're going to lose, and that is relevant, actually, kind of, sort of. They're behind the Wolves. But sitting here right now, the Wolves are a half game behind Golden State, who managed to win once again on Monday night. They've now won 5 consecutive games. They beat Portland by 10 points. The Wolves are a half game behind Golden State for the 6th seed in the West. They are 1 game ahead of the Clippers for the 7th. They are 2.5 up on the Kings, who are 9. It's obviously most important to stay out of the 7-10, but if you're going to be in the 7-10, you want to be in the 7-8 game. Half game behind Golden State for 6th. They are now 3.5 games behind Houston for 5th and 4.5 behind Memphis for 4th. All these teams between 4 and 8, are on winning streaks of at least 3 games. Memphis, Houston in 4 and 5, and LA in 8 have all won 3 games in a row. Golden State and Minnesota in 6 and 7 have each won 5 games in a row. So go figure. Great timing, right? Tiebreakers in the West. The Timberwolves have tiebreakers over Dallas. They've won 2 out of 3 against Dallas. That season series is over. Dallas is currently now 4 games behind the Wolves. And of course, with their self-inflicted situation due to trades and now the injury to Anthony Davis, hopefully that's not an issue. But they have the tiebreaker over Dallas. They have the tiebreaker over Phoenix, who's actually below Dallas now. Phoenix is 7 games, 6.5 games behind Minnesota. That shouldn't matter, but they swept the season series against Phoenix. They also, more importantly, swept the season series against the Clippers, who are only 1 game behind Minnesota. So if they finish with the same record as LA, they get to host that game if they're in the 7-8 game. If they're, I guess that's the most likely way they would play them. But they would have the tiebreaker, or say Golden State loses a few in a row, Minnesota's in 6 and the Clippers are in 7. Minnesota gets to stay in 6 if they have the same record, which would be huge because of that head-to-head tiebreaker. They won all 3 regular season games against the LA Clippers. That's massive. And then the other one they're going to win is Denver. They're only playing the Nuggets 3 times this year. They've already beaten them twice with 1 to play. That probably won't matter because they're now 5.5 games behind the Nuggets. But you never know. If Denver goes on a cold streak, the Wolves get on a hot streak. They have the Denver tiebreaker as well, which also, I guess, to just kind of underscore how well they've played the top of the West, they have the Denver tiebreaker. They're tied with OKC, so there isn't one. They played them to an even 2-2. The Lakers, who are third in the West, they also played to an even 2-2. So top 3 seeds in the West, Minnesota's 2-0 against one of them and 2-2 against the other 2, with 1 to play against Denver. So if they somehow ended up, they won't tie with the Thunder. That's not even possible anymore. But if they somehow ended up tied with the Lakers, there isn't a tiebreaker there, at least not head-to-head. I believe the next is divisional record. I think actually the next tiebreaker is conference record. Next on the list, though, teams that they don't have tiebreakers with, or I should say others that they're tied with, Houston, they're 2-2 against Houston. Houston's 5th in the Western Conference. So they have either even or have the tiebreaker against the 1, 2, 3, and 5 seeds in the West. They also are even against Sacramento, who is 9th, currently 2.5 games behind Minnesota. So they split that season series as well. Teams they don't have the tiebreaker against. Memphis. They've lost both times to Memphis. They have 1 more game against the Grizzlies. That could be significant. They're 4.5 games behind Memphis. Currently, Memphis and LA are tied for the 3 and 4 seeds. So if the Wolves wanted to get into 4, which was one of my bold predictions at the All-Star break, which now looks very unlikely, The Wolves would basically have to lose like 3 times the rest of the season to make this a possibility. But if they go on a really hot streak, they will not have the tiebreaker against the Grizzlies. So that hurts just a little bit. The other one that actually matters quite a bit more, the only other tiebreaker they lose is to Golden State. Golden State's the team they're a half game behind, and they kicked away a couple of games against shorthanded Golden State team shorthanded versions of the Warriors back when Golden State wasn't playing well either. They're 1-3 against the Golden State Warriors this season, which is absolutely brutal considering the injuries they've had, the roster turnover they've had, the different phases of the season that Golden State has had, from the Dennis Schroeder trade to the Jimmy Butler trade. Like, there's really no reason and they won the first game against Golden State back in early December. They lost one in Golden State, and then that 1 point game that they lost in mid-January is the real killer when Steph Curry went off late. But that was a game, like, obviously pre-trade, so like Dennis Schroeder's in that lineup. They had a bunch of injuries, like Draymond Green didn't play. Like it was basically just Steph Curry and like a little bit of Buddy Hield off the bench, and they lost by a point. That could end up biting the Wolves, that tiebreaker, because currently, again, a half game separates them from 6 and 7. So for the same reason why the tiebreaker could help Minnesota against the Clippers, it could hurt them if they end up tied for 6 with Golden State, and it pushes Minnesota down into the play-in because they kicked away some of those silly games, most notably that mid-January one. So keep that in mind as we go down the stretch this season. There aren't really any other significant tiebreaker-related games for Minnesota upcoming because they've already won the series against Denver. They already lost it against Memphis. The others, there really are no other like significant West matchups. Like Utah doesn't matter, New Orleans doesn't matter, Phoenix doesn't matter anymore. They've already won that one anyway. Denver they've won, Memphis they've lost. That's it. So it's all really buttoned up, which is kind of why I wanted to talk about it now. As we head down the stretch here this season, like the teams you are okay with being tied with are, the Clippers, basically, is the most realistic one. You don't want to be tied with Golden State. And the Wolves are right there in that range. So it's going to be fascinating here down the stretch of the season. All right. That's all I got for you today. Wednesday we'll be back. We'll also, part of Wednesday's show, will preview the Nuggets matchup. We haven't seen Denver in a little while, so we'll talk about just how good Nikola Jokic, the 30-20-20 Nikola Jokic himself on Wednesday, and the Nuggets have been playing lately. Among other topics, we'll hit on Wednesday. And then, of course, we'll have the live postcast over at Locked On Sports Minnesota on YouTube following that game. And I'll be back on Thursday with the postgame pod then following Wolves Nuggets. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You could also watch the Locked On Wolves, follow the Locked On Wolves podcast on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. And a reminder about the newsletter at LockedOnDaily.com. It's one stop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now at LockedOnDaily.com. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.